My boyfriend posted a TikTok calling me a project because I drove a 7-year-old Honda 3 days after I paid for our $400 Michelin star anniversary dinner. So I posted one receipt and watched his entire life unravel. My name is Ilara Voss. I was 28 when a TikTok video forced me to accept something I had been avoiding for months. Humiliation does not always come from strangers. Sometimes it comes from the person who knows exactly where your soft spots are. The person who has seen you exhausted after work, crying over family problems, celebrating promotions, planning holidays, and imagining a future together. The person who knows what hurts you and chooses to use it anyway. 3 days before everything exploded, I thought my relationship was stable. Not perfect. Stable. There is a difference. At 28, I was old enough to know that real relationships were not built from movie moments. They were built from ordinary things. Shared grocery lists, missed calls returned later, long work days followed by takeout on the couch, the comfort of knowing someone would be there tomorrow. That was what I thought Adrian and I had. We had been together for 14 months, long enough to know each other's habits, long enough to memorize favorite foods, long enough to start casually talking about future plans. Looking back now, I sometimes wonder if I fell in love with who Adrian was or with who I believed he could become. The two are not always the same. We met at a mutual friend's birthday party. He was charming from the start. The kind of man who could walk into a crowded room and somehow make every conversation orbit around him. He was funny, attractive, confident without seeming arrogant, at least in the beginning. People liked him immediately, including me. During our first few months together, he made loving him feel easy. He brought coffee when I worked late. He remembered little details. He sent voice messages instead of one-word texts. When I was sick, he showed up with soup and stayed until I fell asleep. Those memories are real. I remind myself of that sometimes. Because after a relationship ends badly, it becomes tempting to rewrite history and pretend the good parts never happened. But they did happen. That is what makes betrayal hurt. If everything had been terrible from the beginning, leaving would have been simple. The problem is that heartbreak usually arrives wrapped around memories you still want to keep. At the time, I worked as a financial analyst for a consulting firm. The job paid well. Not billionaire well. Not luxury penthouse well. Just comfortable. I owned a 7-year-old Honda. My apartment was clean, bright, and located in a neighborhood I genuinely liked. I invested most of my extra income. I lived below my means. I slept well because of it. Adrian never understood that. He worked as a receptionist for a real estate office, and there was absolutely nothing wrong with that. What bothered me was never his job. It was the way he seemed obsessed with appearing successful rather than becoming successful. His TikTok account had around 8,000 followers. Not enough to make money, enough to make him care. Every dinner became content. Every outfit became content. Every weekend became content. Sometimes he spent more time filming a moment than actually living it. At first I thought it was harmless. Then it started feeling strange. There were evenings when we'd sit across from each other at dinner, and I would catch him checking engagement numbers instead of listening to what I was saying. I remember one particular night when I was talking about a stressful project at work. Halfway through the conversation, he interrupted me. "Do you think this lighting is better?" He was looking at his phone, not at me, at the lighting. At the time, I laughed it off. Looking back, I had an explanation ready for every warning sign because admitting the truth felt harder than ignoring it. You tell yourself they're distracted, tired, stressed, busy. You explain away things that would concern you if they were happening to someone else. And slowly, without noticing, your standards begin moving. Not upward, downward. The biggest warning signs are rarely dramatic. They're small, easy to dismiss, until enough of them pile together. Last month was our anniversary. I wanted it to be special. I never believed expensive dinners created love. I booked it because I loved him and wanted the night to feel special. I spent weeks researching restaurants before making a reservation at a French restaurant with 1 Michelin star. The waiting list was nearly 3 months long. I booked it anyway. When the confirmation email arrived, I felt excited in the way people do when they're planning something for someone they care about. The dinner ended up costing a little over $400 after wine and tip. It was more than I usually spent. I didn't care. The restaurant was beautiful. Soft lighting, fresh flowers, quiet piano music somewhere in the background. The kind of atmosphere that made people lean closer when they talked. Adrian loved it. At least I thought he did. He photographed everything. The menu, the appetizers, the wine, the dessert, his watch beside the wine glass, the candlelight, the table setting. Half the evening ended up on his Instagram story. I remember watching him smile while scrolling through comments. And I remember feeling relieved. Relieved. That word bothers me now. Because love should not make you feel relieved when someone approves of your effort. It should make you feel appreciated. At the end of dinner, he squeezed my hand and said, "You did good, babe." At the time, I took it as a compliment. Now it sounds more like a performance review. 3 days later, I was lying in bed, scrolling through TikTok before falling asleep. I almost missed the video. His face appeared on my screen. At first, I smiled. Then I noticed the text. "When she says she loves you but can't even afford to take you to Nobu." I blinked, confused. Then another line appeared. "Ma'am, you're 28 with a Honda. I need a woman, not a project." My stomach dropped. The caption hit even harder. "Dating her is my biggest act of charity." And then I saw the tag. Mine. He had tagged me. My chest felt tight. For several seconds, I simply stared at the screen, convinced I had misunderstood something. Maybe it was a joke. Maybe I was missing context. Maybe there was an explanation. That is another thing heartbreak does. Before accepting the truth, your mind desperately searches for alternatives. Anything that hurts less. Then I opened the comments. That ended the search. His friends were laughing. Strangers were laughing. People were discussing me as if I were some embarrassing inconvenience he tolerated out of generosity. One comment called me lucky. Another suggested he deserved someone on his level. Someone else joked that he should trade me in for an upgrade. 14 months. 14 months together, reduced to a punchline. I thought about birthdays, family dinners, long conversations, sick days, the little routines couples build without realizing it. All of it somehow outweighed by a restaurant that wasn't famous enough and a car that wasn't expensive enough. I cried harder than I want to admit. Part of it was heartbreak. Part of it was embarrassment. Mostly, I hated how badly I still wanted an explanation. Then something unexpected happened. The sadness started turning into anger. Not explosive anger. Not revenge. Something quieter. A feeling that maybe I had spent too much time protecting someone who had never worried about protecting me. I replayed the video. I watched it again. By the third viewing, I noticed something. The confidence. The certainty. The way he smiled while saying those things. This was not a mistake. It was not a momentary lapse in judgment. He genuinely expected people to agree with him. That realization hurt more than the video itself, because it meant the problem wasn't what he said. The problem was what he believed. Around 11 that night, I downloaded the same audio. I opened CapCut, and I made a duet. My side of the screen contained exactly 4 words. When he loves your wallet. Then I showed the reservation confirmation, the receipt, the restaurant, the date, the amount. No insults, no yelling, no emotional speech. At the very end, I smiled and waved at the camera. Then I tagged him back. I remember sitting on my bed, staring at the post button for nearly a minute. Part of me knew things would change the moment I pressed it. The question was whether I was willing to let them. Finally, I hit upload. I put my phone down, and for the first time in 3 days, I slept. The next morning, I woke up to 52,000 views. By lunch, it had passed 200,000. By evening, Adrian's original video was collapsing under thousands of comments. His audience had wanted a joke. Instead, they found a receipt. And receipts have a funny way of ending arguments. By noon, my duet had crossed 200,000 views. I spent most of the day pretending to work while my phone vibrated nonstop beside my keyboard. Every few minutes, another notification appeared. Messages from friends. Messages from old classmates. Messages from people I had not spoken to in years, asking if I was the woman from the video. What surprised me most was that I did not feel victorious. If anything, I felt exposed. There is something deeply uncomfortable about watching strangers discuss your relationship. Even when they are defending you, there is still a sense that something private has been dragged into the middle of a crowded room. The difference was that I had not dragged it there. Adrian had. I had simply turned on the light. By the afternoon, his comment section looked like a disaster zone. People were comparing restaurant prices, sharing screenshots, pointing out that the Michelin star restaurant was actually harder to book than Nobu. Others mocked the fact that he was criticizing someone who had paid for an anniversary dinner while contributing nothing except complaints. The irony would have been funny if it had not involved my actual life. Around 2 o'clock, my phone lit up with Adrian's name. I knew the conversation would be ugly before I answered. I was right. "What the hell is wrong with you?" He did not even say hello. His voice came through the speaker sharp and angry. "You completely humiliated me." I turned away from my computer and looked out the office window. The city below continued moving as if nothing unusual had happened. People crossed intersections. Buses stopped and started. Somewhere a delivery driver hurried down a sidewalk. Normal life. Meanwhile, mine felt like it had become an episode of reality television. You humiliated yourself. No, you humiliated me. You tagged me, Adrian. That was different. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was unbelievable. For 14 months, I had listened to him explain why everything was different when he did it. Different standards, different expectations, different rules, different excuses. Somehow, accountability always seemed to belong to everyone except him. You called me a project. It was a joke. You said dating me was charity. It was a joke. You tagged me. Again, a joke. The conversation went in circles. Every criticism became a joke. Every insult became humor. Every consequence became unfair. Eventually, he said something that stayed with me long after the call ended. You could have handled this privately. The sentence hit me harder than the original video, because somewhere beneath all the shouting was an admission. He knew what privacy was. He understood it perfectly. He simply chose not to give it to me. For a moment, I remembered every time I had protected him. Every awkward conversation I kept between us. Every argument I refused to discuss with friends. Every embarrassment I quietly absorbed, because relationships are supposed to be partnerships, not public performances. Then I thought about the video, the tag, the comments, the laughter, and something inside me finally settled. You could have handled it privately too. The line went quiet. A few seconds later, he hung up. No apology, no explanation, just anger. I thought that would be the end of it. An hour later, his mother called. The conversation was somehow worse. She did not ask what happened. She did not ask how I was doing. She did not ask whether her son had actually posted the video. She called with a verdict already prepared. You're a vindictive young woman. I sat back in my chair and listened. There was something oddly familiar about people defending Adrian. Nobody ever wanted to discuss what he had done. They wanted to discuss how everyone reacted to it, as if the response mattered more than the action. You embarrassed my son. He embarrassed himself. No, you just couldn't handle hearing the truth. That word again. Truth. I used to think honesty and kindness naturally belonged together. The older I get, the more I understand they are separate choices. Someone can tell the truth kindly. Someone can tell the truth cruelly. And sometimes people hide cruelty inside the word honesty because it sounds more respectable. The truth, I said carefully, is that I spent $400 on a dinner because I loved your son. She did not respond. He posted the video. I responded. That's what happened. Her voice hardened. My son deserves someone who can meet his standards. After the call ended, I sat quietly for several minutes. The conversation bothered me less than it should have. In fact, it explained quite a lot. Suddenly, Adrian made sense. The obsession with appearances, the constant need for validation, the belief that admiration and respect were the same thing. Nobody develops those ideas in isolation. They learn them somewhere. That evening, Adrian posted another video. More messages followed. Each one sounded a little more frustrated than the last. One showed him looking sadly into the camera while emotional music played. Another talked about knowing your worth. A third suggested he had escaped a toxic relationship. I watched 30 seconds before closing the app. The pattern had become obvious. Every video made things worse. Every explanation created more questions. Every attempt to repair his image damaged it further. At some point, the internet stopped caring about my duet. People became fascinated by Adrian's refusal to stop digging. For the first time since all this began, I stopped worrying about what strangers thought. The evidence spoke for itself. A receipt, a tagged video, a public insult, a response. That was all. A few days later, things became quieter, at least on my side. I returned to work, answered emails, went grocery shopping, did laundry, tried to convince myself life was normal again. The problem with public drama is that it keeps moving even after you stop participating. I had posted one video. One. That was it. Meanwhile, Adrian seemed determined to turn a mistake into a full-time occupation. Every day brought another explanation, another post, another attempt to reposition himself as the victim. The harder he pushed, the more people questioned him. Watching it unfold reminded me of someone trying to sprint through quicksand. Panic became part of the problem. Then my neighbor texted me. Hey, are you okay? That sentence is rarely followed by good news. When I called her, she hesitated. Your boyfriend was here. Ex-boyfriend. The correction happened automatically in my head, not because my feelings had disappeared, because reality had finally caught up with them. He was banging on your door. I felt my stomach tighten. He cried. That surprised me, not because Adrian never cried. I had seen him cry before. The difference was that there always seemed to be an audience nearby. When I got home, I found an envelope pushed beneath my door. Inside were 3 handwritten pages. The first described how badly I had hurt him. The second described the damage done to his reputation. The third finally reached the point. He wanted me to post another video, a public apology, a statement saying I overreacted, a statement saying we were working things out, a statement that would help repair his image. Then I reached the sentence that genuinely made me laugh. If you do that, I would consider giving us another chance. I read it twice, then a third time. The confidence was almost impressive. A man publicly humiliates his girlfriend, blames her for the consequences, and somehow still sees himself as the prize. I folded the letter and put it away. I never responded. 2 days later, another surprise arrived. A text message from one of Adrian's closest friends. The same friend who had mocked me online. The same friend who laughed under the original video. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. By the end, I understood exactly why Adrian never changed. Everyone around him kept rescuing him from accountability. She explained his stress, his pressure, his insecurities, his struggles. Curiously, my feelings never entered the discussion. My humiliation, my embarrassment, my hurt. Those details seemed invisible. Eventually, she reached her main point. You could have been the bigger person. I leaned back on my couch. Why am I the one who has to be the bigger person? A pause followed. Then came the answer. Because you're more mature. That told me everything. Sometimes being called mature is not a compliment. Sometimes it simply means people expect you to tolerate behavior they would never tolerate themselves. I ended the call shortly afterward. Not long after that, reviews started appearing on Adrian's company's page. Nothing threatening. Mostly jokes. Questions about Michelin stars. Questions about Nobu. Questions about whether luxury standards came with property listings. I never encouraged any of it. I barely paid attention. What surprised me was how exhausted I felt. Before this happened, I assumed going viral would feel exciting. In reality, it felt exhausting. You wake up every morning wondering what new version of your life strangers are discussing. Then one evening, Adrian left a voicemail. His voice sounded different, less angry, more desperate. My boss called me into a meeting. I listened quietly. They think I'm hurting the company's image. A pause followed. Then came the accusation. This is because of you. When the message ended, I sat alone in my apartment and stared at the phone. For a few seconds, I felt absolutely nothing. Then sadness arrived. Not for him, for us, for the version of our future that no longer existed. Because underneath all the drama, all the videos, all the arrogance, I could still remember the man who brought me coffee when I worked late. The man who made me laugh. The man I once imagined introducing as my husband. Losing a relationship hurts. Losing the future attached to that relationship hurts even more. That night, I walked through the city alone. The air felt cool against my skin. People filled the sidewalks. Couples laughed outside restaurants. Life kept moving forward without waiting for anyone. As I walked, I thought about something my grandmother used to say. People tell you who they are long before they leave. At the time, I never really understood what she meant. During those walks home, I finally did. The signs had always been there. I simply translated them into something easier to live with. And somewhere between protecting his feelings and ignoring my instincts, I had slowly stopped protecting myself. By the time I got home, I no longer had any doubts. The relationship was over. The TikTok video had not ended it. The internet had not ended it. The comments had not ended it. What ended it was much simpler. Respect stopped mattering. Attention became more important. Everything that happened afterward was just proof. For about 5 days, everything became quiet. Not completely quiet. The internet never really forgets something once it has tasted a little drama. But compared to the chaos of the previous weeks, the silence felt almost luxurious. No new videos. No emotional speeches. No late-night voicemails. No friends suddenly appearing to explain why I should feel guilty for reacting to something Adrian had started himself. For the first time in weeks, I slept through the night without checking my phone. I genuinely thought the worst was behind me. I should have known better. Some people do not leave a burning building. They keep running back inside, hoping to save their pride. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning while I was drinking coffee before work. At first glance, it looked official. Professional formatting. Legal-sounding language. Carefully chosen words designed to make an ordinary person nervous. The sender identified himself as a digital reputation consultant representing Adrian. I actually laughed. A month earlier, I might have found that title intimidating. Now it sounded like someone charging money to explain why consequences existed. According to the email, Adrian had suffered professional and emotional damages because of my duet. The consultant suggested several solutions. Remove the video. Issue a public apology. Acknowledge that my response had been misleading. Avoid discussing the relationship moving forward. Potentially compensate Adrian for lost opportunities. In return, Adrian would supposedly refrain from pursuing further action. I read the email twice. then a third time. Not because I felt afraid, because I was fascinated by the confidence required to send something so detached from reality. Everything that happened traced back to one decision. His decision. The video. The tag. The caption. The comments. Yet somehow he had convinced himself that the fallout belonged to me. I forwarded the email to my college friend Lena, who had become an attorney. 10 minutes later, my phone rang. The moment I answered, she burst out laughing. Please tell me this is fake. It isn't. She laughed even harder. Then she spent the next 15 minutes explaining why the email amounted to little more than intimidation wrapped in expensive vocabulary. The receipt existed. The reservation existed. The screenshots existed. The video existed. Nothing had been fabricated. Nothing had been altered. Truth is a difficult obstacle when someone wants to accuse you of lying. By the end of the call, a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying disappeared. I was tired of defending myself. Tired of worrying. Tired of wondering what new version of reality Adrian might invent next. For the first time since everything started, I stopped feeling afraid of what would happen next. 3 days later, another email arrived. This one came directly from Adrian. No consultant. No threats. No legal language. Just a message. He said he had been thinking. He said he regretted how things unfolded. He said he missed me. He admitted social media had become unhealthy. He admitted chasing validation had changed him. For a moment, I wanted to believe him. That was the frustrating part. Even after everything, a small piece of me still remembered the beginning. The coffee deliveries, the birthday surprises, the nights we spent talking about our future. The hardest part wasn't remembering the bad moments. It was remembering the good ones and knowing they weren't enough to save the relationship. I sat on my couch rereading the message. A month earlier, I would have answered immediately. Now I found myself reading between the lines. Something felt off. Then I figured out why. The email focused almost entirely on his pain, his embarrassment, his loneliness, his regrets, his losses. There was barely a sentence about mine. Nothing about opening TikTok and discovering that the man I loved had turned me into content. Nothing about becoming a joke in front of hundreds of thousands of strangers. Nothing about trust. Nothing about respect. That told me everything I needed to know. I responded politely. I wish you well, Adrian. I just don't think there's anything left to discuss. The answer arrived minutes later. Seriously? More messages followed. Each one became a little more frustrated than the last. After everything we had, I deserve at least one conversation. You won't even listen? The messages kept coming. At first they sounded hurt, then frustrated, then angry. By the fifth message, the familiar pattern had returned. The version of Adrian who viewed every boundary as a personal attack. Finally, he sent one last text. If you want to play games, we can play games. I stared at the screen. Oddly enough, disappointment hit harder than anger. A small part of me had hoped the apology was genuine. That final message answered the question. I saved screenshots. Then I put my phone away. Outside my apartment, an evening settled across the city. Cars flowed through intersections. People hurried home from work. Somewhere below my building, someone laughed loudly enough for me to hear it through the window. Life continued. And for the first time, I understood that closure does not always arrive as an apology. Sometimes it arrives as confirmation. Confirmation that you made the right decision. That night, I looked through old photographs one last time. Our beach trip, our anniversary dinner, the birthday party where we met. I expected tears. Instead, I felt calm, not healed, not happy, just calmer than before. Like someone who had spent weeks searching for an answer and finally accepted it. I closed the album. And for the first time, I didn't open it again. The following week was surprisingly peaceful. Work became my focus again. I started meeting friends for dinner. I went on evening walks. I returned to books I had abandoned months earlier. What surprised me most was how quiet my own mind felt. For months, I had been expecting the next argument before it even happened. Suddenly, there was nothing to prepare for. The next explanation. The next disappointment. When that disappears, the silence feels unfamiliar. Then it starts feeling wonderful. 5 days later, my phone rang from an unknown number. Normally, I would have ignored it. Something told me not to. The voice belonged to Adrian's father. I had only met him twice. Both times, he had seemed quiet and observant. The kind of person who listened more than he spoke. I wanted to apologize, he said. For what? For my son. Rain tapped softly against my office window while we talked. He admitted Adrian was wrong. Completely wrong. No excuses. No qualifications. No attempts to soften it. Just honesty. Then he said something that stayed with me. Sometimes people get so attached to being admired that they forget who they are. He wasn't talking about social media. He was talking about Adrian. He explained how Adrian's mother had always valued appearances. Status, image, luxury. recognition. Everything needed to look impressive. As he spoke, pieces of the puzzle finally clicked together. The comparisons, the obsession with expensive things, the constant need for approval, the inability to accept criticism. It all made sense. Not as an excuse, as an explanation. There is a difference. Before ending the call, he gave me one warning. He'll come back. I stayed quiet. He'll tell you he's changed. Still quiet. He'll tell you he finally understands. The rain continued falling. Then he said something that hit harder than anything else. He doesn't miss you, Alara. I frowned. He misses losing. The words followed me long after the conversation ended. 3 days later, his prediction came true. A knock sounded on my apartment door. I checked the peephole. Adrian. For a brief second, my heart reacted before my brain did. Old habits die slowly. Old feelings even slower. He knocked again. Then again. Alara? I didn't answer. I know you're home. His voice sounded tired. For a moment, I considered opening the door. I didn't want him back. What I wanted was an explanation that finally made sense. Standing there, I finally understood something I should have accepted weeks earlier. The person who broke your trust is rarely capable of repairing it with a perfect explanation. Eventually, I spoke through the door. What do you want? I just want to talk. The words sounded familiar. Too familiar. We already talked. No, we didn't. We did. Several seconds passed. Then his voice softened. I miss you. Months earlier, those words would have broken me. Now they only made me sad. I didn't believe him anymore. What hurt was remembering the version of me who once would have. I think you miss losing me, I said quietly. The silence that followed told me more than any speech could have. Can you open the door? No. This is embarrassing. I almost laughed. Public embarrassment had never bothered him when I was the target. Now suddenly it mattered. A few minutes later, he asked one final question. So that's it? I looked around my apartment. At the peaceful life waiting on the other side of that door. And for the first time, the answer came easily. Yes. Eventually, I heard footsteps walking away. Then nothing. No dramatic scene. No screaming. No tears. Just a man leaving, and a woman finally choosing not to follow. A few weeks later, I was having dinner with coworkers when I saw Adrian again. He was sitting across from another woman. A date. For a brief moment, old memories surfaced. Then they settled, like dust. He looked tired. Not physically. The kind of tired that settles into someone after they've spent months fighting consequences they never expected to face. The confidence that used to fill every room seemed quieter now. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked like someone carrying the weight of his own choices. He walked over and apologized. A real apology this time. No excuses. No blame. No performance. Just ownership. He admitted he had been chasing approval. He admitted he cared too much about what strangers thought. He admitted he had been wrong. And for the first time, I believed him. Not enough to go back. Just enough to accept the apology. When he asked if I hated him, I shook my head. I don't. And I meant it. Hatred requires energy. I had already spent enough energy on him. The woman from his table eventually approached. I shook her hand, wished them both a good evening, then returned to my friends. The conversation resumed. The laughter returned. And something unexpected happened. Nothing. No jealousy. No anger. No sadness. No regret. For months, I imagined closure would feel dramatic. Instead, it felt ordinary, like setting down a heavy bag and realizing you had been carrying it for far too long. A week later, I privated my duet. Not because I regretted it. I didn't. It had done exactly what it needed to do. The truth had been told. The story had ended. A few days after that, I ran into Adrian's father at a coffee shop. Before leaving, he smiled and said, "I'm proud of how you handled everything." I thanked him. Then he added one final sentence. His growth isn't your responsibility. He was right. That was probably the biggest lesson hidden inside all of this. For too long, I thought if I was patient enough, supportive enough, understanding enough, things would eventually improve. They didn't. Months earlier, I thought losing Adrian was the tragedy. Now I understood something else. Looking back, staying would have been the real loss. I had spent too long confusing attention for love and validation for intimacy. Validation for intimacy. Performance for connection. Life moved forward after that. Work stayed busy. Friendships grew stronger. I laughed more. Slept better. Thought about him less. And every now and then, when someone mentioned TikTok drama, I smiled to myself. Funny enough, I never cared about Nobu. Years from now, I probably won't remember the restaurant either. What I'll remember is the moment I stopped begging someone to see my value and started seeing it myself. What mattered was finally accepting that someone who truly values you never needs to make you prove your worth in the first place.